presenting on life celebration to mourning memorial, death perspectives, spiritual affiliation, and life satisfaction.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the packed house in here. All right, so death and dying affects all generations and religions. It is underrepresented in academic literature. Around 3.4 million people died in the U.S. in 2021, and on average, each death results in 5 grieving friends or family members and approximately 17 million people grieving a loss each year. So given the inevitability and breadth of its effect, we must find a way to better manage life's conclusion. If death perspectives fall along the spectrum from loss, conclusion of life, to gain potential afterlife, then it's reasonable to conclude that religious views play a part in one's death perspective and perception of life, satisfaction, and purpose. However, only a handful of studies have found a direct relationship between religious conviction and life satisfaction. Perhaps a more meaningful approach is a more flexible spectrum from a mournful conclusion of life to growth or celebratory, the milestone of the cycle perspective. A mournful approach is associated with more traditional organized religions, while celebratory approaches tend to accommodate a broad, wide range of beliefs and practices. This is important to note due to the recent decline in traditional religious affiliations and the increase in atheist, agnostic, and spiritual identifications. So part of these changes are due to generational shifts. The millennial and Gen Z cohorts are the 2 youngest generational cohorts that comprise a little under half of the United States population. These cohorts are also the most unhappy, with an increase of 63% between 18 and 25-year-olds and 52% between 12 and 17-year-olds in major depressive symptoms from 2005 to 2017. 31% of college students reported an anxiety condition in 2021, and 71% of millennials with 79% of Gen Z reported feeling lonely in 2019. Additionally, Gen Z is also the least religious cohort, with 49% identifying as either atheist, agnostic, or having no religion at all, compared to 44% of millennials. And so identification with spirituality has increased across all ages since 2012. This transition from religious belief in God to spiritual is likely attributable to the flexibility of spiritual belief rather than the adherence to religious doctrines, and how spirituality retains some of the well-being promoting features of religious practices. Another reason for a looser definition in belief in God as spiritual may be its ability to be utilized to help put death in perspective and find purpose in life. So many studies find that religiosity has a positive effect on well-being. Religious people are less likely to be depressed, abuse substances, commit suicide, be diagnosed with stress-related disorders, and some researchers even approximate religious involvement to account for 2 to 6% variance in life satisfaction. Despite all the positive evidence, many positive correlations come only from participation in the religious community. And the increased life satisfaction is contingent on that church attendance and the friendship aspect, not the religion and spirituality, or the religion and affiliation itself. So while religious people are more satisfied in life, the increase in life satisfaction is contingent on specific factors such as a strong religious identity, and there's little evidence that other subjective factors, aside from that attendance to church events, have a positive effect. In the largest meta-analysis of religion and spirituality, or RS, and life satisfaction, with a 256 effect sizes, which is a sample size of about 100,000, found that religion and life satisfaction were significantly positively correlated. However, it was strongest within older samples from more religious countries. And otherwise, it was a small to moderate association depending on the specific dimension measured, which is generally consistent with previous studies. Further, there's evidence to show how the overall relationship between religion and spirituality and life satisfaction is small. For example, another meta-analysis of 48 longitudinal studies examined if positive effects of religion and spirituality predicted future levels of life satisfaction, and that analysis found that out of 8 distinguished religious predictors, only participation in public religious activities like that church attendance and the importance of religion, which is that strong identity, were significantly correlated to life satisfaction. So this kind of research highlights how empirically unclear this relationship is. So the purpose of my study is to better characterize the relationship, if it exists, between life satisfaction and spiritual affiliation, and the positive correlations between these and death attitudes. This project is also relatively exploratory. due to the lack of ethnic literature regarding ethnic identity in the small, not significantly diverse population we have to pull from. The goal here is to better identify how death perspectives influence life satisfaction in their relationship to spiritual affiliation, and we're also interested in how spirituality and attitudes towards death contribute to mortality saliency, which is the awareness of your own dying. So this topic of confronting one's own death and dying is academically underrepresented, as I said earlier, as current research primarily focuses on end-of-life decisions, care, ethics, bereavement, and near-death experiences. So this lack of discussion in literature on the process of your own dying. So this research explores the mindsets and perspectives on death and dying in hopes of assisting the management of our own mortality and encouraging people to examine the concept of death with the motivation of improving their own sense of life satisfaction. Take a sip of water. So proud of myself for that. Okay, so let's jump into hypotheses. So the first one is that it's predicted that those who adhere to a more rigid dogmatic religious affiliation like Judeo-Christian relative to a less dogmatic, more philosophical affiliation such as spirituality will score lower on some mortality attitudes. Second, we anticipate that those with fear of death or death avoidance will have opposing life satisfaction scores compared to those who are non-fearful and non-avoidant. We predict those with mortality fearfulness will also evidence death avoidant attitudes. Fourthly, it's anticipated that ethnic identity may moderate death attitudes, so seeing differences across ethnic identities. And lastly, that self-transcendence and a celebratory perspective on death will be related to ethnic identity. So for participants, we conveniently sampled 103 participants consisting of Pacific University students and those who were solicited through social media with an average age of 29. Here's a generational breakdown. So Gen Z comprised 69%, millennials as 17%, Gen X as 12, and boomers with 2. Shout out to my 2 boomers, wherever you are. Here's a breakdown by gender ID. We had 64% male, 64% female, 26% male, and almost 10% as genderqueer. Then here's sexual identity with 63% being heterosexual and 37% being non-heteronormative. This includes homosexual, queer, pan, etc. And then we have a breakdown of ethnic identity with 70% as Euro-American, nearly 14% as Hispanic, and the remaining 16 made up of Indigenous, Asian, and African-American participants. Another sip of water. All right, so using the Qualtrics online survey platform software, participants received implicit informed consent protocol followed by demographic questions, such as gender ID, sexual ID, age, religious affiliation, etc. And these are the 5 measures that relate specifically to life satisfaction or happiness in general. So the satisfaction with life scale measures one's self-awareness of their life on a 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Then we have the meaning of life questionnaire, which assesses one's sense of meaning in life and the presence or search of that on a 7-point scale from absolutely untrue to absolutely true. Then we have the caring for bliss scale, which is defined as the cultivation of inner joy based on a peaceful state of mind and compassionate heart. Then the flourishing scale, which is self-perceived success in important areas such as relationship, self-esteem, purpose, optimism. Then we have the positive negative affect scale, or PANAS, which is what I will refer to. It's a long name. Measures mood through distinct subscales of positive and negative affect on a 5-point scale from never to all the time. Then we have the 4 death and dying related measures. So first is the multi-dimensional mortality awareness scale. This has 5 subscales of mortality legacy, fearfulness, acceptance, disempowerment, and disengagement. This measures attitudes towards your own mortality on a 5-point scale from disagree to agree. Then we have the self-transcendence scale. Note this definition, it will come back in the hypotheses. So this is a major psychosocial and spiritual resource of developmental maturity, which is defined as the expansion of self-boundaries in multi-dimensional ways. So, such as inward with introspective activities, outward by caring for others, temporally by using the past and the future to enhance the present, and then transpersonally by connecting to a higher or greater sense of purpose or dimension. And then we have the death transcendence scale, which also has 5 subscales of mysticism, religious, nature, creative, and biosocial. This explores the individual's desire to transcend death and to be remembered either as an individual or in relation to their other relationships or impacts on their environment. And lastly, we have the death attitude profile revised. This has 5 subscales of fear of death, death avoidance, neutral acceptance, approach acceptance, and escape acceptance, and this measures your attitude towards death. So here we have the design and procedure. This was an IRB-approved study with a descriptive design. The Qualtrics online survey platform was used to administer, record, and score all item responses for informed consent, demographic questions, and then 9 published measures totaling 168 questions. It was really long, so shout out to everyone who completed it. And our participants were recruited for 6 weeks. All right, so our first hypothesis, that it was predicted that those who adhere to a more rigid religious affiliation relative to the more philosophical one will score lower in some mortality attitudes. This was supported. We used an independent samples t-test, so scores on mortality acceptance, which is being aware that death is a part of life. Those scores were significantly higher among those who had self-identified as spiritual, agnostic, or atheist relative to those who self-described as religious. Second, those with a fear of death or death avoidance will have opposing life satisfaction scores compared to those who are non-fearful, non-avoidant. This was also supported. So scores on approach acceptance, which is the idea that you'll be reunited with loved ones in the afterlife, were negatively correlated with the satisfaction of life scale, meaning of life questionnaire, caring for bliss scale, and the PANAS-GEN. And scores on fear of death were positively correlated with the meaning of life questionnaire. So let me explain. The negative correlations with approach acceptance is likely explained due to how the belief of reunification with a loved one stems from more religious doctrines. So the more you believe reunification, the more you identify with those religious doctrines. And as I mentioned earlier, unless you regularly attend services and have that group experience, identifying with a religious doctrine decreases the likelihood of that positive correlation, especially considering the potential loneliness from lack of group affiliation or the potential guilt from just not being involved traditionally. And then the positive correlation with fear of death can be explained through how the higher one's fear of being dead or fear of what will happen is, the higher their sense of meaning in life may be due to how that fear of losing something, which is your life, motivates the value of having it. And conversely, how a low sense of meaning in life tends to lead to a low fear of dying since it's not really valuable to have in the first place. However, part of this prediction did fail to reject the null because scores on the death avoidant attitude were not significantly correlated for any life satisfaction or happiness related measure, nor did we have a diverse sample. Third, we predict that those with mortality fearfulness will also evidence death avoidance attitudes. This looks significant, but in the opposite as we first predicted. So although scores on mortality fearfulness were positively correlated with fear of death, this means that those who fear death also fear their own mortality. Surprise. Scores on mortality fearfulness were negatively correlated with death avoidance, which is that anxiety about death and potential pain, and neutral acceptance, which everybody dies is natural. So for the neutral acceptance, it makes sense. The more one believes in death as natural, the less they feel nervous or afraid about their mortality. But with death avoidance, it was odd to me that these were negatively correlated with mortality fearfulness, as those seem fairly alike. My thought is perhaps that the more nervous you are about death in general, the less nervous you are about your personal death, since that anxiety is more generalized. So fourth, it was anticipated that the ethnic identity may moderate death attitudes, and then fifth, that self-transcendent celebratory approach on death will be related to ethnic identity. These both failed to reject the null, as there were no significant differences across ethnic identity and death attitudes, self-transcendence, or death perspectives, most likely due again to our small, not very diverse sample. Although, scores on the self-transcendence scale, this is why I had you pay attention earlier, were positively correlated with neutral acceptance and negatively correlated with approach acceptance. So this suggests that the more comfortable you are with death as part of nature, the higher levels of self-transcendence, that expansion of self-boundaries. And the higher level of self-transcendence, the less you believe in reuniting with loved ones in the afterlife and vice versa. Furthermore, scores on the self-transcendence scale were positively correlated with every single happiness and life satisfaction measure. So these correlations suggest that the higher level of self-transcendence, the happier you are in various areas of your life. Further, by scoring mournful as 0 and celebratory as 1, we created a score spectrum. And so we found that there were positive correlations between those who identified more with the celebratory side, with higher scores on death avoidance, self-transcendence, and the caring for bliss scale. And then those who were closer to the celebratory perspective also had lower fears of mortality. So we conducted a 3 gender by 2 sexuality by 5 ethnic identity by 4 generation MANOVA, mouthful. We found a main effect for ethnicity relative to the death transcendent scale subscore of religious. This refers to the desire to transcend death through religious traditions such as being a part of an afterlife. There is also a main effect with ethnic identity in the nature subscale, which is the desire to transcend death naturally, so that belief that we're all a part of nature, dying is natural. And we also found main effects with the Pan-Estrogen positive and the caring for bliss scale. So the Pan-Estrogen positive measures the positive affect side, so these are positive emotions and expressions like cheerfulness, pride, and joy. And then the caring for bliss scale measures that cultivation of inner joy. So here's a graph that shows those averages relative to ethnic groups across these 4 measures. So for the religious and nature subscales, you can see that the average scores across the board were higher with natural than religious, which suggests an overall higher identification with a natural perspective versus a religious one. And most interesting here were the similarities between the Pan-Estrogen positive and the caring for bliss scale. You can see that aside from the African American group, these scores were nearly identical, and this makes sense as they both measure a form of happiness. And aside from that, I'm not an expert on ethnic differences, nor did I get a diverse sample, nor is there great literature regarding this, so I'm not in a position to comment anymore on this part of the results. So we did not find any main effects for gender ID or sexual ID on any measure alone, but there was an interaction between gender and sexuality on scores across mortality and disempowerment, and this is the view that thinking about death makes you feel like things are pointless. And there's also an interaction between these scores and death avoidance, which is that attitude that you get anxiety about how you will die and the potential pain of dying. There's also an interaction with sexual ID and ethnicity on scores of mortality acceptance, so that death is a part of life. And then another with scores on the death transcendent scale and that religious subscale that we mentioned earlier, that we're all part of nature and dying is natural. So the purpose of this was to investigate the relationships between life satisfaction, spiritual affiliation, and death perspectives among college students. Here are some key takeaways from the results. So 1, non-traditional spiritual views may moderate mortality acceptance, so that may help your acceptance of your own mortality. The more acceptance of death as natural may decrease your fear of dying. Developing a high level of self-transcendence may increase overall life satisfaction and well-being, and then a celebratory approach may increase well-being and decrease the fear of dying. So for future research, I hope to contribute to the ongoing conversation around how to approach death in a psychologically healthy way, and how confronting it can improve overall life satisfaction and comfort with mortality. So I want to thank Dr. Heidi Island for her guidance over these last 2 years, my fellow Capstone students for their feedback, encouragement, and stress bonding. Riley and I and Piper and Julia were all texting all last night. Also shout out to Tyler for starting this with me 2 years ago. And then thank you to my partner Jefferson for letting me give him a presentation every day the last 5 days in a row and supporting me through all of this. And here's the link to any references and resources, and thank you guys so much for coming.